Margaret Hayes stood at the iron gates of Hillside Cemetery, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. At 62, she had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most. Her daughter Emma had been gone for 3 years now, and the emptiness never quite went away. But today wasn't about grief. Today was about answers. She'd received an anonymous letter last week, just 5 words. Emma didn't die by accident. No signature, no return address, just those 5 words that had shattered 3 years of carefully constructed peace. Margaret walked the familiar stone pathway toward Emma's grave, her Chanel heels clicking with cold precision. That's when she noticed them. A man in a janitor's uniform kneeling beside her daughter's headstone, and beside him, a little girl no more than 5 years old with long brown hair and a yellow sweater. They were both crying softly. Something twisted in Margaret's chest. Not grief this time. Suspicion. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp as a knife. "What are you doing here? This is my daughter's grave." The man looked up, startled. His eyes were kind but haunted, the eyes of someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone. The little girl clutched his arm, frightened. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said, quickly wiping his face. "We didn't mean any disrespect. We'll leave." "No." Margaret's voice could have frozen the flowers on Emma's grave. "You'll tell me who you are and why you're crying over my daughter's grave like you knew her." The man hesitated. He glanced down at the little girl, then back at Margaret with a look she recognized instantly, fear mixed with desperate hope. "My name is Daniel Foster," he said quietly, "and this is my daughter, Sophie. Your daughter Emma. She saved my wife's life, and then someone took hers for it." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. "What did you say?" Daniel's hands were shaking. "I was there the night Emma died. It wasn't an accident, Mrs. Hayes, and I know who did it. 3 years ago, Emma Hayes was the brightest nurse at Mercy General Hospital. She had her mother's steel and her father's stubborn sense of justice, a combination that made her both beloved by patients and dangerous to the wrong people." Margaret remembered visiting Emma at the hospital once, watching her daughter advocate fiercely for a patient who couldn't afford treatment. Emma had marched right into the administrator's office and demanded they honor their charity care policy. She'd won, of course. Emma always won when she was fighting for someone else. But Margaret hadn't known the full story, not until now. Daniel Foster led her to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the cemetery. Sophie sat between them, drawing pictures on napkins with crayons Daniel had pulled from his jacket pocket, clearly a practiced routine. "I worked night shifts as a custodian at Mercy General," Daniel began, his voice low. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. We had nothing. No insurance, no savings. I was working 2 jobs and still drowning." Margaret's eyes softened slightly, but she remained still as stone. Emma was Sarah's nurse. She stayed after her shifts, brought books, made Sarah laugh even when the pain was unbearable. Daniel's voice cracked. But that wasn't all she did. Emma noticed something wrong. Wrong how? Daniel leaned forward. The hospital's charity care fund. Millions of dollars donated specifically for patients like Sarah who couldn't afford treatment. Emma discovered it was being siphoned. Falsified records, phantom patients, billing for treatments never given. All of it funneled into private accounts. Margaret's jaw tightened. Who? Dr. Harrison Blake, Chief of Oncology, and Thomas Whitmore, the hospital's CFO. She knew those names. Harrison Blake had attended Emma's funeral. He'd given a speech about what a dedicated nurse she was, how tragic the accident had been. Margaret remembered shaking his hand, thanking him for his kind words. The memory now made her want to vomit. "Emma found the evidence," Daniel continued. "She was going to report it. She told me the night before she died. She was excited, thought she was going to help so many people." He laughed bitterly. She had no idea she was signing her own death warrant. "The car accident," Margaret whispered. "They said a drunk driver." "There was no drunk driver. The man they arrested was paid to take the fall. He's sitting in prison right now on a manslaughter charge he didn't commit. Emma's brakes were tampered with. I know because I saw the mechanic Blake hired. I saw him leaving the hospital parking lot that night. I know his face." "Then why didn't you go to the police?" Daniel's eyes went dark. "I did. The detective assigned to the case, he's Blake's cousin. The investigation was dead before it started. And when I pushed, They threatened Sophie. His hand moved protectively toward his daughter. They said if I talked, I'd watch my daughter die the same way Sarah did, slowly, painfully, with no one to help. Sophie looked up at her father with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the horror being discussed above her head. Margaret sat in absolute stillness. The coffee in front of her had gone cold. The cafe bustled around them, people laughing, chatting, living their ordinary lives while her world restructured itself into something cold and purposeful. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn manila envelope. "Because they got careless. They thought I was too scared to move. But I've been watching, collecting, waiting for 3 years." He slid the envelope across the table. "I've got everything. Bank records. Testimony from the mechanic. He's dying of lung cancer now, got nothing left to lose. Security footage from the parking garage that night. Email chains. Everything." Margaret's fingers touched the envelope. It felt like holding a bomb. "Why me? Why not take this to the FBI, the state attorney, anyone?" Daniel smiled grimly. "I'm a janitor, Mrs. Hayes. A poor man with a young daughter and no connections. I go to the authorities, Blake's lawyers will bury me, but you—" He nodded toward her diamond earrings, her tailored coat, the quiet authority that radiated from every pore. "You have something I don't. Power, money, the kind of influence that makes people return phone calls." Margaret opened the envelope. Inside were documents, photographs, and a USB drive. She scanned the first few pages, hospital financial records with irregularities highlighted in yellow, a sworn affidavit from someone named Marcus Webb, timestamps and security camera stills. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Whatever you have to." Daniel's eyes burned with 3 years of suppressed rage. "Make them pay. Not just legally, make them feel what we felt. Make them watch everything they built crumble while they can't do a damn thing to stop it." Margaret looked at the envelope, then at Daniel, then at little Sophie still drawing her crayon pictures, and finally at her own hands, manicured, steady, capable. "Mr. Foster," she said quietly, "do you know who I was before I married my husband?" Daniel shook his head. "I was Margaret Chen. My father built the largest pharmaceutical distribution network on the West Coast. When I married Richard Hayes, I brought my family's connections to his family's money. I spent 30 years learning how to destroy competitors, acquire companies, and dismantle empires." She met Daniel's eyes with a gaze that could have cut glass. "Those skills didn't disappear when I retired?" She tucked the envelope into her purse with the care of a surgeon handling a scalpel. "Go home, Mr. Foster, hug your daughter, and wait. When you hear the screaming start, you'll know I've begun." The first thing Margaret did was nothing. For 3 weeks, she lived her normal life, charity luncheons, board meetings, golf with her late husband's business partners. She smiled, laughed at jokes, wrote checks to good causes, and gave absolutely no indication that anything had changed. Meanwhile, in a rented office space under the name of a shell company, 6 layers removed from her own holdings, a team of private investigators, forensic accountants, and former federal prosecutors worked around the clock. The evidence Daniel had provided was good, but Margaret wanted it perfect. She wanted a case so airtight that not even God could poke holes in it. She hired a retired FBI cybercrime specialist to verify the digital evidence. She hired a former hospital administrator to explain exactly how the billing fraud worked. She paid Marcus Webb's medical bills so he could live long enough to testify if needed, and got his statement notarized and witnessed by 3 lawyers. But she didn't stop there. Margaret knew that men like Blake and Whitmore didn't operate alone. They needed enablers, sycophants, people who looked the other way in exchange for promotions and bonuses. She needed to identify every single person who had helped cover up her daughter's murder and destroy them all. Her investigators discovered that Blake's cousin, the detective who had buried the investigation, had recently purchased a vacation home in the Bahamas far beyond his salary. They found that the hospital's head of legal had signed off on destroying Emma's personnel file just 3 days after her death. They found that the chairman of the hospital board had received consulting fees from a company that existed only on paper. The web was vast and tangled and corrupt to its core, and Margaret was going to burn every strand of it. What Harrison Blake didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Margaret Hayes sat on the board of directors of the holding company that owned Mercy General Hospital's primary insurance carrier. She didn't announce herself. She simply attended a routine board meeting, listened to quarterly reports, and then asked a single innocent question. "I've heard some concerns about our exposure at Mercy General. Are we confident in their billing practices?" The room went quiet. The CEO shifted uncomfortably. "There have been some irregularities flagged in routine audits," he admitted. "Nothing conclusive." "I'd like to see a full independent review," Margaret said sweetly. "Given our exposure, I think the board would agree it's prudent, don't you?" The motion passed unanimously. No one wanted to be the person who voted against due diligence. 2 weeks later, Mercy General's insurance carrier announced it was conducting a comprehensive billing audit going back 10 years. The hospital's stock dropped 7% in a single day. Blake called an emergency board meeting. Margaret watched the coverage from her living room, sipping tea. "Phase 1, she murmured to herself. Panic. The second attack came from a direction Blake never expected. His investors. Dr. Harrison Blake didn't just run the oncology department. He had a side business, a network of private cancer treatment clinics that had made him extremely wealthy. The clinics depended on referrals from Mercy General and the perception that Blake was a respected medical professional. Margaret had spent 3 weeks identifying every major investor in Blake's clinic network. Then she'd had a very quiet lunch with a reporter from the Wall Street Journal's healthcare beat, a woman named Sarah Chen who coincidentally had lost her own mother to cancer 2 years ago. "I can't tell you where to look," Margaret had said over salads that cost more than most people's rent, "but I can tell you that if you examine the relationship between Dr. Harrison Blake's private clinics and his role at Mercy General, you might find some interesting conflicts of interest." Sarah Chen found more than conflicts of interest. She found that Blake had been steering patients from the hospital's charity care program to his private clinics, where they were charged full price despite qualifying for free treatment. She found that he'd been using hospital resources, staff, equipment, research, for his private business without compensation. She found that 6 patients had died after receiving experimental treatments at his clinics that had never been properly approved. The story ran on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, 3 of Blake's 5 major investors had pulled out. His clinic's certification was suspended pending investigation, and the state medical board announced it was reviewing his license. Blake appeared on television, sweating through his $1,000 suit, proclaiming his innocence. Margaret watched him stammer and deflect, and she smiled. "He doesn't know it's me," she said to the empty room. "He thinks this is coincidence. He thinks he's just having bad luck." She poured herself another cup of tea. Phase 2. Isolation. Thomas Whitmore, the hospital's CFO, was the smarter of the two. He saw the walls closing in before Blake did, and he made his move. Margaret's people intercepted his attempt to transfer funds to an offshore account. They watched him shred documents in his office at 2 a.m. They tracked his conversations with criminal defense attorneys. But Whitmore had made one mistake. In his panic, he'd reached out to an old friend from business school, someone who could help him disappear if things got too hot. That old friend now owed Margaret Hayes a very significant debt. 10 years ago, she had quietly paid for his daughter's rehab when insurance refused coverage, and his pride wouldn't let him ask for help. He'd sworn he would repay her someday. Margaret called in the favor. "Don't help him," she said. "Don't warn him. When he asks about leaving the country, tell him you'll look into it, and then tell me everything he says." 3 days later, Margaret knew Whitmore's entire escape plan. She knew which airport, which passport, which country, and she knew exactly when he planned to run. She let him get all the way to the airport, let him check his bags, pass through security, settle into his first-class seat with a glass of champagne and a relieved smile. The FBI arrested him on the jetway, 30 feet from freedom. The charges: wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Blake found out about Whitmore's arrest while in the middle of a television interview defending himself against the Journal's allegations. Margaret arranged to be watching from the green room, posing as a hospital board member there to show support. She saw the exact moment his face changed, saw hope drain out of his eyes like water from a broken glass. "Dr. Blake," the reporter was saying. "We're just getting word that Thomas Whitmore, Mercy General's CFO, has been arrested at JFK Airport. Can you comment?" Blake's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Dr. Blake, are you aware of the charges? Wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder? I need to speak with my attorney." He ripped out his earpiece and stormed off the set. Margaret stepped into the hallway just as he passed, close enough to touch. "Dr. Blake," she said calmly. He turned. His face was pale, sweating, the face of a man watching his world collapse. "Do I know you?" "We've met." Margaret smiled. "At my daughter's funeral. You gave such a lovely speech about Emma. Such a dedicated nurse, you said. Such a tragic accident." Recognition dawned in his eyes. Then terror. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, I'm not asking you to say anything." Margaret leaned closer, close enough that only he could hear. "I just wanted you to know that I know. I've known for 3 months now. And everything that's happening to you, the audits, the investors, the reporters, Whitmore's arrest, that's all me." Blake's face went gray. "You can't prove anything. I'll fight this. I have lawyers." "You have lawyers," Margaret agreed. "But I have patience, and evidence, and 30 years of experience destroying people who think they can't be touched." She patted his cheek like he was a confused child. "The FBI will be at your house in about, I'd say 2 hours. I wanted to give you time to feel it, to understand what's coming and know you can't stop it." She stepped back. "Say hello to my daughter when you see her." "Oh wait, you won't. Where you're going it's quite a bit warmer." She walked away without looking back. Behind her she heard Blake's ragged breathing, heard him fumbling for his phone, heard the desperate edge of a man who finally understood he'd been hunted by something much more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The arrest came that evening, just as Margaret had promised. 23 FBI agents executed simultaneous raids on Blake's home, his clinics, and his office at the hospital. They found evidence of the billing fraud. They found communications discussing the nurse problem. They found a burner phone with texts to the mechanic who had tampered with Emma's brakes. The mechanic himself had died 2 weeks prior, but not before giving a detailed sworn statement naming Blake as the man who ordered Emma's murder. The indictment listed 47 counts: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and 3 counts of first-degree murder, Emma, and 2 patients who had died from his unapproved experimental treatments. Margaret watched the coverage from her living room. She didn't celebrate, she didn't cry. She simply sat in her chair and watched the news cycle devour the man who had killed her daughter. The fallout spread like wildfire. The detective who had buried the investigation was arrested for obstruction of justice. The hospital's head of legal was disbarred and charged as an accessory. The board chairman resigned and fled to his daughter's house in Vermont, where reporters found him hiding in the basement. Mercy General's CEO stepped down. The insurance company that Margaret had subtly weaponized settled with the state for $200 million in penalties. 3 other hospitals in the region began internal reviews, terrified of being the next domino to fall. The fake drunk driver, the man sitting in prison for a crime he didn't commit, was released after Daniel Foster's testimony confirmed the frame job. He walked out of prison into a media frenzy, blinking in the sunlight like a man who'd been buried alive and dug himself out. Margaret paid for his legal representation too, and his housing, and his son's college tuition. She didn't want thanks. She just wanted every last thread of Blake's crime unwoven, every last victim made whole. 6 months later, Margaret returned to Hillside Cemetery. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock, the same time she always visited. But this time, she wasn't alone. Daniel Foster walked beside her, carrying Sophie on his shoulders. Sophie was chattering about her new school, the one in the better district that Margaret had quietly arranged. Daniel had a new job too, facilities manager at a nonprofit medical clinic that actually helped people who couldn't afford treatment. The salary was modest, but the work mattered. They stopped at Emma's grave. Fresh flowers were already there. Daniel and Sophie had come earlier that morning. "It's done," Margaret said quietly. "Blake got life without parole. Whitmore got 30 years. The others all took plea deals." Daniel nodded. "I saw. Sarah would have been proud. Emma, too." Margaret touched the headstone, cold marble, smooth and permanent. "I used to come here to grieve," she said. "Now I come to report, to tell Emma what I've done, what I'm doing. She smiled faintly. I've established a foundation in her name. Free legal representation for medical whistleblowers, so the next Emma doesn't have to fight alone. Sophie tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Daddy, can I put my picture? Of course, sweetheart. Sophie climbed down and carefully placed a crayon drawing against the headstone. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands, a woman with silver hair, a man in a blue uniform, a little girl in yellow, and an angel with golden hair watching over them all, connected by a golden thread. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the day she opened Daniel's envelope. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, for believing me, for doing what I couldn't. Margaret shook her head. You gave me the truth. That's the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me. She looked at him, at Sophie, at the grave of her daughter. Emma would have loved you both. She had a gift for collecting good people. They stood in silence for a moment, 3 strangers bound together by tragedy and justice. What will you do now? Daniel asked. Margaret considered the question. She thought about her empty house, her charity boards, her careful routines. The foundation needs a director, she said, someone who understands what it means to be silenced, to be afraid, to have no one believe you. She looked at Daniel. Interested? Daniel's eyes went wide. Mrs. Hayes, I'm a janitor. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know how to fight, you know how to wait, you know how to protect the people who matter. Margaret smiled. Everything else can be learned. Sophie tugged on Daniel's hand. Daddy, does this mean we get to see Grandma Margaret more? Daniel looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Sophie. Grandma Margaret, she repeated softly. It was the first time anyone had called her that. Richard had died before they could have grandchildren. Emma had never married. Is that okay? Sophie asked, suddenly uncertain. Daddy said you might not like it. Margaret knelt down, ignoring the grass stains on her designer pants. She took Sophie's small hands in her own. Sophie, she said, I would be honored. They walked out of the cemetery together, the billionaire, the janitor, and the little girl who had given her a new name. Behind them, Emma's grave stood in the afternoon light, surrounded by flowers and drawings, and the quiet evidence of lives still being lived. Margaret had come to this cemetery seeking her daughter. She had found instead what Emma had left behind, a reminder that justice isn't always loud, that revenge doesn't have to be cruel, and that the greatest victory is building something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. The lonely widow had come to a grave expecting grief. She left with a family, and somewhere, in whatever place good souls go, Emma Hayes smiled. Her mother had always been fierce. Now that fierceness had a purpose again, and the men who had thought they could kill without consequence. They had learned the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate a mother with nothing left to lose. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Emma Hayes Foundation occupied the entire 14th floor of a downtown office building. Through the glass walls, you could see a small army of lawyers, investigators, and advocates, all working to protect the people who tried to do the right thing. Margaret sat in her corner office, reviewing case files. The foundation had handled 47 whistleblower cases in its first year. 32 had resulted in successful settlements or prosecutions. 12 were ongoing. 3 had been dropped when the whistleblowers got cold feet. But even those, Margaret ensured they were protected from retaliation. A knock at her door. Mrs. Hayes? Her assistant, a young woman named Rachel, who had been one of Emma's nursing school classmates. Mr. Foster is here for the board meeting, and Sophie made you something. Margaret smiled. Send them in. Daniel entered wearing a suit that actually fit now. Margaret had insisted. He'd proven himself as the foundation's director, combining his street-level understanding of how institutions failed people with a natural talent for organization that had probably been wasted pushing a mop for 15 years. Sophie ran in behind him, clutching a piece of paper. Grandma Margaret, look what I made. She held up a drawing. It showed the foundation building with tiny stick figures in the windows. At the very top, looking down at them all, was an angel with golden hair. That's Mommy Emma, Sophie explained. She watches over the foundation. Daddy told me she helps people who are scared, and now we help people who are scared too, so she must be really happy. Margaret took the drawing carefully, as if it were made of gold. "It's perfect, Sophie. We'll hang it in the conference room where everyone can see." Sophie beamed and ran off to find Rachel, who always had candy hidden in her desk. Daniel watched her go, then turned to Margaret. "You know, a year ago I thought my life was over. I thought Sophie would grow up with a father who was too afraid to do anything but survive. And now? Now I wake up every day knowing that we're making a difference, that Emma's death meant something, that Sophie will grow up seeing her father fight for what's right." Margaret nodded. "That's exactly what I wanted." "Really? Not the convictions? Not watching Blake rot in prison?" Margaret considered the question. She thought about Blake, locked away for the rest of his natural life. She thought about Whitmore, who had tried to hang himself in his cell 3 months into his sentence and was now on suicide watch. She thought about all the enablers whose careers and reputations had been destroyed, who would never again be trusted with power. "The convictions were necessary," she said finally. "Justice demanded them, but they weren't the goal." "What was the goal?" Margaret looked around her office, at the case files, the photos of successful whistleblowers, the Foundation's mission statement framed on the wall. Emma spent her whole life trying to help people. When she found evidence of wrongdoing, she didn't think about herself. She thought about the patients being cheated, the money that should have paid for treatment. She died because she cared more about doing right than staying safe. She met Daniel's eyes. The goal was to make sure that her spirit, that impulse to help, to fight, to speak truth to power, didn't die with her. The convictions were revenge. But this? She gestured at the Foundation, the staff visible through the glass walls, the work being done in Emma's name. "This is legacy." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "You know what I think? I think Emma knew exactly what she was doing when she befriended a janitor and his dying wife. I think she knew that someday, someone would need to tell you the truth, and she made sure there would be someone brave enough to do it." Margaret blinked. She had never considered it that way. "You think Emma planned this?" "Not planned, but prepared. She was a nurse. She knew things could go wrong at any moment. So she built connections. She helped people. She made sure that if anything ever happened to her, there would be witnesses who actually cared." He shrugged. "Maybe I'm wrong. But I like to think that even now, she's still looking out for us. Still fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves." Margaret thought about Sophie's drawing, the angel with golden hair, watching over them all. "I like to think that too," she said softly. The board meeting started 15 minutes later. They discussed new cases, budget allocations, expansion plans. Sophie sat in the corner drawing pictures while the adults talked about justice and procedure and organizational charts. At the end of the meeting, Margaret stood at the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, people were being silenced, threatened, afraid to speak the truth. But now they had somewhere to turn. Now they had Emma's foundation, Emma's legacy, Emma's mother, still fighting, still fierce, still absolutely unwilling to let the powerful destroy the innocent without consequence. Margaret touched the glass, cool against her fingertips. "I hope you can see this, Emma," she whispered. "I hope you know that you won, that they didn't silence you, that your voice is louder now than it ever was." A small hand slipped into hers. Sophie had wandered over, drawn by some child's instinct for when adults needed comfort. "Grandma Margaret? Are you talking to Mommy Emma?" "Yes, sweetheart, I am." "Tell her I said hi, and tell her—" Sophie squeezed her hand. "Tell her thank you for bringing you to us." Margaret looked down at this child who had lost her mother, been threatened by monsters, and somehow still believed in angels and golden threads and the fundamental goodness of the world. "I'll tell her," Margaret promised. She looked back out the window at the city full of people fighting their own battles, carrying their own secrets, hoping someone would believe them. The Foundation's phone lines lit up constantly. Every call was someone taking a risk, trusting that maybe this time would be different. Margaret would make sure it was. For Emma, for Daniel, for Sophie, for every person who had ever been told to stay quiet and look the other way. The lonely billionaire had gone to a cemetery seeking her daughter. She had found instead a purpose, a family, a legacy that would outlast them all. And the men who had thought they could kill without consequence? They had learned the oldest lesson in the book. Never underestimate a mother's love, because a mother's love doesn't just grieve, it avenges. And then, when the vengeance is complete, It builds something beautiful from the ruins, something that lasts, something that matters, something that ensures the same tragedy never happens again. Margaret smiled at Sophie, at the foundation, at the future spreading out before them. Emma was gone, but Emma's work had only just begun.